That summer, I took my wife and our 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, camping in the National Forest Park. Everything seemed peaceful, but as night fell, a deep howl echoed from afar. The sound was like a long wail of some animal, with a strange, half-crying intonation. I frowned and looked into the depths of the forest, where the campfire's light could not reach further. However, the sound did not stop, instead, it grew closer. Sophie was frightened and whispered, "Daddy, I hear someone laughing." Her words stunned my wife and me. Laughter? There shouldn't be anyone in this forest. I asked my wife to take Sophie back to the tent, while I, holding a flashlight, walked towards the direction of the sound. In the darkness, the trees loomed like clawing giants, with shadows cast across the ground. My heart raced, and my light scanned the surroundings, revealing only dead branches and leaves, nothing more. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by the strange sound again, the same long howl I had heard earlier. Turning my head, I discovered Sophie was not in the tent. Her blanket was still there, but there was no trace of her. I woke my wife, and we frantically searched the campsite, calling her name. A few minutes later, we spotted Sophie in the forest, standing motionless under a large tree, her hands hanging down, her face pale, and her eyes hollowly staring at us. "Sophie!" My wife rushed over and hugged her, but Sophie stood like a puppet, her lips slightly trembling. She whispered, "They want me to come over." I immediately held her in my arms, intending to take her back to the campsite. But as I turned around, several tall figures appeared among the trees. These figures seemed humanoid, but with eerily elongated limbs. Their faces were shrouded in darkness, and only the faint glimmer of cold light could be seen in their sunken eye sockets, their mouths split open as if smiling. They did not move, just stood quietly in the shadows, staring at us intently, their gazes deep enough to swallow everything. I was holding Sophie and shouted to my wife, "Back to the car." We left all our belongings behind and ran desperately towards the parking area along the path we had taken. The footsteps behind us were unrelenting, and the deep howling sounded again, mixed with the strange sounds that seemed like laughter. Upon reaching the car, I practically pushed Sophie and my wife inside, then started the engine and stepped on the gas. The headlights illuminated the dark forest path, and through the rearview mirror, I saw those tall figures still standing in place, their hollow eye sockets staring straight at us, as if gazing or perhaps laughing. After returning to town, we reported to the police, but they found nothing in that forest. They said people often get lost in the forest and hear strange noises, but that's just a natural phenomenon. Later, I asked Sophie what the people in the trees had said to her. She stared at me blankly and whispered, "They said I should stay and keep them company." A few summers ago, 3 friends Joshua, Kevin, Lisa and I decided to go camping in the forest. We chose a remote area seldom visited by people. In the evening, after setting up our tents and preparing to start a fire, a man emerged from the woods. He appeared to be in his 30s, dressed in dirty clothes, and with a weary expression. He claimed to be lost and unable to find his way back to town. We found it strange because the forest was so secluded, but we decided to help him anyway. The man sat by the campfire, speaking little, only mentioning that his name was Tom and that he had come for a hiking trip but had been lost for 2 days. His voice was deep, and his gaze was shifty. Lisa whispered to me that she felt something was off about this person. I shared her suspicion but said nothing. "How did you find us?" Kevin asked. "I saw your firelight and followed it," Tom replied, but his voice sounded like he was hiding something. As night fell, we let Tom sleep a bit farther from our tents. He seemed to carry no luggage and had no cold weather gear. As we took turns keeping watch, we always felt like he was secretly observing us, but every time we looked over, his eyes were closed. When it was my turn to keep watch, the atmosphere in the campsite became eerily quiet. The firelight flickered, and tree shadows swayed around us. I stared at Tom's tent, feeling an inexplicable unease. As the night deepened, the surroundings grew colder, and the flames weakened. Suddenly, I heard faint footsteps, as if someone was moving nearby. I looked up, peering past the firelight, and saw Tom standing outside his tent. His figure was hidden in the darkness, with only a vague silhouette visible. He stood motionless, seemingly observing us. Time ticked by, and the darkness outside the forest seemed like a boundless abyss, swallowing the faint glow of the campfire. Suddenly, I heard a very soft rustling sound, like someone walking on dry leaves. I jerked my head up, looking through the campsite, and saw Tom's back. He was stealthily standing outside a tent not far away, his body rigid, as if listening to the movements inside. I held my breath, my heart racing, silently gripping the flashlight in my hand. I dared not make a sound, just staring intently at the figure. Tom moved, turning his head slightly, and our eyes met. At that moment, the flickering firelight illuminated his pale face, his eyes hollow and eerie, the corners of his mouth slightly raised, as if tracing a cold smile. A chill ran down my spine. Tom did not approach but turned and continued walking towards the forest, his steps heavy yet slow, as if deliberately dragging out each step to echo clearly in the night. I endured my unease, silently calculating the time in my mind, thinking the next person would soon come to relieve me of my watch. I didn't want to disturb the others, but I also dared not let that person disappear from my sight. After a while, the rustling sound came again, this time from another direction. Tom was back. He did not walk directly to the tent but circled the campsite, over and over, deliberately treading lightly each time, as if testing our patience. The fire grew dimmer, and the cold air surged from all directions, permeating every inch of space. That rustling sound seemed like the footsteps of death, drawing ever closer in the darkness. This time he was closer, his steps almost stopping by our tent. My palms were sweaty, and my heart raced. I gently reached out and touched the tent fabric, feeling something outside, as if separated by a thin barrier. Suddenly, a very low creaking sound rang out. Tom seemed to be opening some bag or tool. In desperation, I shouted, startling everyone and scaring Tom outside. He quickly turned and ran away. Joshua, seeing movement outside the tent, rushed out, but by then, Tom had already run into the forest. I told my companions about Tom's situation, and we were all very tense. That night, none of us dared to sleep, staring intently at the forest. The next morning, when I returned to town, I learned that the person I had confronted the night before was a notorious wanted murderer. Thinking about how that person had wandered around us multiple times during the night but never entered the tent, we all felt a chill down our spines, as if we had narrowly escaped death's grasp. That day, my girlfriend, Jessie, and I strolled by the lake, which was eerily quiet. It was the second day of our camping trip. As we approached the water, I suddenly noticed a strange shape by the lake. I took a few steps closer, a sense of inexplicable curiosity stirring within me. It was a circle of stones, arranged with unusual neatness, like the remnants of some ritual. The surfaces of the stones were not smooth, they were covered with symbols I had never seen before, resembling ancient runes. "Look at these stones," I whispered, pointing at them. She came over, her brow slightly furrowed. Each stone was meticulously placed, forming a perfect circle as if deliberately arranged by someone. These symbols did not belong to any language I was familiar with. They appeared to have been carved with some sharp tool, and over time, the edges of the symbols had become blurred, but they still exuded an indescribable power. She squatted beside me, cautiously reaching out her hand to touch one of the stones. I suddenly grabbed her wrist and whispered, "Don't touch them." She looked up at me, a flicker of confusion and fear in her eyes. "Do you think they're dangerous?" At that moment, a breeze suddenly arose on the lake, and the previously silent water began to gently lap at the shore. The air became unusually heavy, and I felt something watching us from the shadows, perhaps from the deep forest or the depths of the lake. "We should leave here," she whispered, her gaze drifting around as if she too sensed the invisible pressure. I nodded and stood up. As we turned to leave, I heard a faint whispering sound behind us, like the wind softly murmuring in my ear. I stopped, my heart racing, and looked back at the stones, but there was nothing there. That night, I was awakened by a series of whispers. I poked my head out of the tent and saw Jessie standing by the lake, motionless, staring at the shimmering water. I called to her softly, but she didn't respond. As I approached, I saw her lips moving, repeating a string of words I couldn't understand. Jessie's eyes were vacant, as if controlled by some force. I tried to shake her awake, but her body suddenly went limp and collapsed into my arms. When I carried her back to the tent, her breathing steadied, but she fell into a deep, unconscious state. Her face was pale, and her lips trembled slightly, as if silently speaking, but I couldn't hear any sound. I tried to wake her up, shaking her shoulders, but she didn't respond at all. The night passed, and as dawn approached, I felt a chill enveloping us. She still lay there with her eyes closed, as if trapped in a nightmare. I checked her forehead and found her temperature unusually cold. She showed no signs of illness. I tried every method to wake her up, but all I could hear were her intermittently muttering those strange phrases, as if they were voices from another world. I began to suspect that the stones and runes we found by the lake the previous night were related. As time went by, her condition did not improve. Her breathing became weaker, and the phrases became clearer, as if some ritual was underway. I could no longer wait and decided to return to the stone circle, where there might be answers. I left her in the tent and hurried towards the lake. When I arrived at the circle of stones again, the runes seemed more vivid than the night before, as if emitting a faint glow. I knew time was running out and could not take any more risks. I immediately returned to the tent, deciding to take her away from Eerie Place. She remained unconscious and unable to walk, so I had to carry her to the car and started the engine, driving towards the nearest hospital. Just as the car left the lake, she suddenly opened her eyes, looking clear-headed, as if waking from a nightmare. She looked at me in confusion, her voice weak but clear. "What happened?" I couldn't believe my eyes. Fear from just moments ago seemed to vanish in an instant. I briefly told her about the experience, and she seemed to have no memory of it. We both felt incredulous but relieved that she had returned to normal. As our car drove further and further away, the Erie Lake also gradually disappeared in the rearview mirror.